Iran thought it had built the perfect weapon. For decades, thrones sat at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz and told the world quietly, persistently, and with absolute conviction that this narrow corridor of water was its ultimate trump card. Close the strait and the global economy chokes. Close the strait and America backs down. Close the strait and every nation on earth that needs oil comes crawling to Thrawn for permission to survive. It was the most powerful geographic weapon in modern geopolitical history. And in February 2026, Iran finally played it. But what Iran did not calculate, what its strategists failed to model, what its generals never prepared for, is that the moment it closed the strait, it handed its own neighbors the political permission to destroy the one thing Iran had spent 40 years using as leverage. The UAE just did something that Iran cannot recover from. It did not fire a missile. It did not send in troops. It opened a pipeline. And in doing so, it began the permanent dismantling of the most dangerous card Iran ever held. Let's start with what the closure of the Strait of Hormuz actually meant in raw numbers. Because without those numbers, nothing else in this story makes sense. Before February 28, 2026, approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day passed through the strait. That is roughly 20% of all global petroleum liquids consumption. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas also transited that 39-kilometer wide waterway every single day. In 2025, nearly 15 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate, representing 34% of all global crude oil trade, moved through Hormuz. 84% of that went to Asian markets. China and India combined received 44% of all Hormuz crude oil flows. Japan and South Korea were critically dependent. The IEA had no language for what happens when all of that stops moving. The world had never needed that language before, because Iran's leverage had always depended on the threat of closure, not the reality of it. Then came the reality when the US and Israel launched their strikes on Iran on February 28th. The IRGC immediately closed the strait. Maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed by more than 90%. Somewhere between 17 and 20 million barrels of oil per day were removed from global markets in what the Defense Horizon Journal described as potentially the largest single energy disruption in modern history. Shipping firms suspended operations. War risk insurance became effectively unavailable. Oil prices surged past $100 per barrel, and the entire world began desperately searching for the answer to one question. Is there any way to move this oil that does not go through the strait? The answer was yes, partially. And the geography of that partial answer is exactly what is now turning Iran's greatest weapon into its greatest strategic disaster. Because the only countries in the Gulf region that have meaningful pipeline infrastructure capable of bypassing the Strait of Hormuz are Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And both of those countries, as of March 2026, are no longer neutral parties in the Iran story. They are adversaries, active declared pipeline opening adversaries. The UAE's pipeline, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, also known as ADCOP, or the Habanera pipeline, runs 380 kilometers from the Habshan oil and gas fields in southwestern Abu Dhabi through the UAE's interior to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Fujairah sits on the other side of the UAE from the Persian Gulf outside the Strait of Hormuz, entirely already on the open ocean, already connected to the shipping routes that lead to Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. The pipeline has a designed capacity of approximately 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day. And the moment Iran closed the strait, the UAE began pumping through it at maximum capacity, diverting its crude oil exports entirely away from the strait and out through Fujairah into the global market. According to Kepler's senior oil analyst, Naveen Das, the 80-cup pipeline was running at 71% utilization when the crisis hit, with approximately 440,000 barrels per day of spare capacity available. ADNO, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, can temporarily raise throughput to 1.8 million barrels per day if required. They required it. They did it. But here's what makes this strategic move so devastating for Iran, and why the thumbnail says what it says. The UAE did not just open its pipeline. It also told the world publicly, UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, known globally as MBZ, called Iran an enemy in March 2026. Not a rival, not a neighbor with competing interests, an enemy. The UAE closed its embassy in Tehran and withdrew all diplomatic staff the day after the war began. It closed Iranian institutions inside the UAE, schools, cultural centers, official representations, and then in a move that would have been unthinkable even 12 months earlier, the UAE publicly announced that it would support a U.S. military operation to forcefully take control of the Strait of Hormuz. The Wall Street Journal reported that the UAE was actively pushing the U.S. to conduct such an operation and was looking into what military contributions it could make to help break Iran's grip. An Emirati official told the journal that UAE diplomats had urged the U.S. along with European and Asian military powers to establish a coalition to forcefully open Hormuz. The UAE even suggested the U.S. should occupy Iranian-held islands in the strait, including Abu Musa, which is claimed by Abu Dhabi. This is not a neutral country threading a diplomatic needle. This is a country that has been bombed by Iran, that has watched Iranian missiles and drones strike its airports, its refineries, its financial centers, and its ports, and that has responded by declaring Iran an enemy and signing up to help destroy Iran's most powerful strategic tool. And the reason this matters so much goes beyond the immediate crisis. It represents the permanent, possibly irreversible alienation of the Gulf Cooperation Council states from Iran. These are the countries that Iran needed to remain at least somewhat ambivalent, countries whose economic interests and regional stability previously created a buffer against outright confrontation with Tehran. That buffer is gone. The trust gap, as Gulf states described it to CNBC, might never be repaired. The scale of Iran's attacks on the UAE helps explain why. According to the UAE Ministry of Defense, Iranian forces tracked 174 ballistic missiles at the UAE. 161 were intercepted, 13 fell into the sea, and 689 drones were detected, with 645 intercepted. 8 cruise missiles actually struck Emirati territory. Iranian drones hit the port of Fujairah, the terminus of the very pipeline the UAE was using to bypass the strait, triggering fires and temporarily suspending oil loading operations. Iranian drones struck Dubai International Airport, causing a fire and temporarily closing the airport. An Iranian strike hit an Adnossi refinery facility that would otherwise produce 922,000 barrels of oil per day, forcing a shutdown. A tower in Dubai Creek Harbor was hit. The Dubai International Financial Center Innovation Hub was damaged. A Palestinian national was killed by a missile hitting a civilian car in Abu Dhabi. 2 UAE service members died in a helicopter crash during defensive operations. Iran did not just threaten the UAE. It attacked it repeatedly, recklessly, and without restraint, including striking the exact infrastructure the UAE needs to export its own oil through the Fujairah bypass. Iran's strategy to punish the UAE for supporting American operations managed with perfect irony to strengthen the UAE's resolve to permanently end Iranian control of the strait rather than negotiate a return to the status quo. Now let's talk about what Iran's Hormuz weapon actually costs Iran itself, because this is the dimension that most analysis misses completely. Iran needs the strait too. Iran's own oil exports, what remains of them under decades of Western sanctions, have historically transited Hormuz. Iran inaugurated its own bypass pipeline, the Gajus pipeline, in July 2021, specifically designed to give it an alternative export route on the Gulf of Oman. But that pipeline's effective capacity remains approximately 300,000 barrels per day, and it actually stopped loading cargoes after September 2024, before the current crisis even began. Iran's Jazz bypass is not operational at meaningful scale, which means Iran closed a waterway that it also needs in pursuit of leverage over countries that have alternatives. It does not. The strategic miscalculation here is staggering in its dimensions. Saudi Arabia's pipeline response has amplified the UAE's action into something that approaches a genuine, if partial, redirect of Gulf energy flows. Saudi Arabia's east-west crude oil pipeline also known as the Petrol Line, runs 1 to 100 kilometers from the Ukai Oil Processing Center near the Persian Gulf Coast to the Yamu export hub on the Red Sea. In March 2026, Saudi Arabia pumps 7 million barrels per day through this pipeline, dramatically above the 2 million barrels per day it was using before the crisis. The pipeline's total capacity is rated at 5 million barrels per day, with a previously stated upgrade to 7 million. Saudi Arabia hit that ceiling and held it. Together, the Saudi and UAE pipelines have a combined available capacity of approximately 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, according to IEA figures, with Saudi's actual pumping touching the upper end of that range. That is still far below the 20 million barrels per day that transited Hormuz before the crisis, but it is enough to keep Asian buyers supplied at reduced rates, enough to prevent a complete energy catastrophe, and enough to demonstrate that the world can function at painful cost, but function without Iranian permission to use the strait. Iran's response to this pipeline pivot was exactly what you would expect from a strategy that has run out of options. It attacked the bypass infrastructure. Iranian drones struck the Fayar port, the UAE pipeline's endpoint. Iranian attacks targeted pumping stations on the Saudi East-West pipeline in April, cutting throughput by approximately 700,000 barrels per day. Energy analyst George, quoted by Al Jazeera, described pipelines and pumping stations as static, high-value targets, easier to hit than moving ships, impossible to hide, expensive to repair. Iran was correct about the vulnerability, but hitting these targets did not restore Iranian leverage. It accelerated the coalescence of the Gulf states, the United States, Europe, and Asia around the goal of permanently ending Iranian control of the strait. Every Iranian missile that hit a UAE facility converted one more diplomatic stakeholder into an active opponent. Every drone that struck Fujairah oil infrastructure made one more Asian country dependent on Gulf oil, angrier at Tehran, and more supportive of military action to reopen the waterway permanently. The geopolitical reconfiguration of the Gulf that is now underway goes far beyond the immediate crisis. What the Iran war has done to the region's strategic architecture is something that will take years to fully understand, but its basic outlines are already clear. The Gulf Cooperation Council states, which previously maintained a studied ambiguity toward Iran, conducting trade, maintaining embassies, avoiding direct confrontation, have been forced off the fence by Iranian missiles landing in their cities. As the Atlantic Council's analysis put it, they have been exposed. The perception of Gulf Arab states as safe havens in a tough region is shattered. An unnamed longtime investor in the region told the council that a higher risk premium in the eyes of investors and companies is now the new reality and cannot be eliminated by any outcome of the war that he can envision. But if the Gulf states have been exposed as vulnerable, Iran has been exposed as something far more dangerous, reckless. The Atlantic Council's analysis noted that Iran attacked GCC countries with 83% of its total missile and drone strikes during the war, with the UAE receiving the most attacks of any country, including Israel. Iran did not confine its retaliation to the US and Israel, who actually launched the strikes. It bombed Kuwait's airport. It hit Qatar. It struck Bahrain. It hammered the UAE with nearly 1,000 missiles and drones. And by doing so, it converted every Gulf state from a potential diplomatic bridge, as they had sometimes served before, into a party with direct, personal, visceral reasons to want Iranian military power permanently destroyed. If Iran was hoping the Gulf states would pressure Washington to back down and negotiate, it chose the worst possible method of making that argument. The longer-term consequence of what the UAE is doing, operating its bypass pipeline at full capacity, supporting U.S. military operations, closing its embassy in Tehran, declaring Iran an enemy, is the permanent reconfiguration of the region's energy infrastructure away from Iranian choke point leverage. Gulf oil producers, according to CNBC's reporting, are now highly wary of the threat posed by Iran and are looking for permanent ways to reroute their supplies and bypass the Strait of Hormuz. The closure has demonstrated, in the words of energy security analyst Coffey, that assumptions about the cost of closing Hormuz being too high for any actor were breakable. Once broken, they cannot be unbroken. The deterrence architecture that Iran built around the strait, the assumption that the economic interdependence surrounding it made closure unthinkable, has been destroyed by the fact that Iran chose to think the unthinkable. And now every Gulf state, every Asian energy importer, every multinational oil company is investing in the infrastructure and the relationships that will reduce their dependence on Iran's geographic position. The 116-kilometer UAE corridor concept, a proposed cross-peninsula infrastructure link connecting Sharjah's Port Khaled on the Persian Gulf side to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman side, which could function as either a pipeline or eventually a canal, represents the most ambitious version of this long-term bypass project. The Defense Horizon Journal's analysis framed it clearly. For every barrel that exits through Fujairah rather than the strait, Iran's most powerful deterrent is directly eroded. A bypass capable of carrying 2 to 4 million barrels per day would not replace Hormuz, but it would reduce the catastrophic leverage of closing it, transforming Hormuz from a binary on-off switch for global energy to one important route among several. And that transformation, once completed permanently, changes the strategic equation that Iran has depended on for 4 decades. Iran's plan was to weaponize geography. The UAE's plan, backed by Saudi Arabia, supported by the U.S. Navy, cheered on by every Asian country that needs Gulf oil, is to make that geography irrelevant. Not tomorrow, not in 6 months, but over the course of the infrastructure investments and diplomatic realignments that the 2026 crisis has permanently accelerated. The choke point that gave Iran its leverage is being engineered out of the equation. Every pipeline pumped to maximum capacity, every new bypass route surveyed, every long-dormant infrastructure project suddenly flushed with emergency funding. All of it is the slow-motion dismantling of the weapon Iran thought it could hold over the world forever. Iran closed the strait to prove that it was indispensable. What it actually proved is that the world is motivated, capable, and now actively working to make it dispensable. The UAE opened its pipeline. Saudi Arabia maxed its petrol lane. Asian nations scrambled to find alternative routes and sign new supply agreements. The international coalition coalesced around the goal of permanently opening the waterway. And Iran, which bombed its own neighbors, destroyed its own regional relationships, and sacrificed 40 years of carefully cultivated deterrence, architecture, and a single military gamble, is left watching the world, engineered its way around the weapon it never expected anyone to actually try to circumvent. The Strait of Hormuz's route is not just gone for now. It is being systematically and permanently bypassed, and the country that built its entire strategic identity around controlling it has been beheaded not by a missile, but by a pipeline, and by the collective decision of the world. It tried to hold hostage to find another way,